I will begin with a necessary disclaimer. I am not a psychologist or mental health professional in any capacity. Everything you hear is comprised of my personal views based on extensive independent research, and when it comes to PDA, observation and introspection. What I say must always be taken with a pinch of salt. I would also like to point out that I do not support, embrace or subscribe to the medical model of disability. In this piece of writing, I am using features of DSM-5 conditions as they are described as my way of differentiating them from features found in PDA literature. I'm also avoiding going into etiology, as my intention here is to focus mainly on the subject in question. Thank you. This characteristic of PDA is not spoken about nearly as much as the others, and I'm not quite sure why, to be honest, as I find it to be among the most fascinating things about the profile. In the list of criteria, Pda Social Obsessions, or as I prefer to say, social interests, are described thus. The individual displays obsessive behaviour often focused on people. Alas, I sometimes worry that this is perhaps a little too vague or misleading. For a start, other conditions exhibit this trait, but in ways that differ to the essence of a social obsession of the PDA kind. In borderline personality disorder, or BPD, for example, the individual may appear on the surface to exhibit socially obsessive tendencies similar to those of a PDA person, but the drivers and the underlying causes could not be more different. In BPD, the individual is motivated by their need to avoid abandonment. There is little focus on the person with whom they are obsessed or to whom they become attached, which makes this type of social obsession more emotionally based and non-intellectual in nature. It doesn't really matter who the person is. The BPD person, when obsessed with someone, needs to feel wanted. This obsession might pan out as a series of desperate attempts to keep a person with whom they are obsessed or interested. Overall, this obsession is characterized by a strong and indiscriminate need for another as an attempt to avoid abandonment and alleviate feelings of chronic inner emptiness. And now, for another social obsession, again of a completely different kind. In narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, individuals are prone to experiencing extreme and seething envy towards others who pose a direct threat to their status or self-perceived superiority. Consider a narcissist in the workplace who has managed to obtain a reputation amongst their team as the cleverest, funniest, or most efficient worker. Such a role would be vital to the survival of the narcissist's brittle identity. Belief in being unique or special is also a criterion of NPD, and to feel anything other than this would feel like total annihilation to the narcissist. Imagine if a new employee began to work in the same office who manages to elicit more laughter from the rest of the team, and who bears more knowledge on a variety of topics, proves more diligent and overall more popular and likeable than the narcissist. Such a person would effectively become the narcissist's new social obsession, as they would feel robbed of what they believe they are entitled to, the reputation as the most special and important person in the room. Insofar as such a person exists in the narcissist's life, they can never fully relax, and they may trash said person either internally or explicitly, which would be the narcissist's way of devaluing their source of insecurity as a form of self-reparation. Narcissists may generally feel bitter about people who are successful, believing that it should be they who deserve such fruits, even without putting in any label whatsoever. When it comes to NPD, social obsessions are quite simple. The narcissist feels entitled to so much and is addicted to certain responses from their environment. If other people possess or are in receipt of that which the narcissist craves, the narcissist will become envious and angered by what they believe to be theft of what is rightfully theirs. Now we move into territory that many professionals wrongly believe is indistinguishable or strongly reminiscent of PDA. Attachment disorder takes on two forms: reactive attachment disorder, RAD, and disinhibited social engagement disorder, DSED. In RAD, children are believed to have the capacity to form selective attachments to people, but the condition itself is characterized by a pattern of inhibited, emotionally withdrawn behavior towards their caregivers. This manifests as the child not really reaching out for comfort or affection when they feel unhappy or distressed, or not responding to their caregiver's attempts to comfort them. DSED, on the other hand, is a little different. Like with PDA, a DSED child can be irreducibly disinhibited when approaching unfamiliar people, refusing to adhere to social barriers or failing to respect the personal space of others. Attachment disorder children are prone to testing people out by doing extreme things, whimsically for the purposes of measuring or eliciting reactions from people. It's almost as if this is some kind of inverted attachment forming strategy to test how attached other people are to them, or a method by which the attachment disorder child determines their value and worth in other people's eyes by seeing how much other people can take before they resort to abandonment. Something of a fearful, self-fulfilling prophecy. And now, at last, we come to social obsessions of the PDA kind, or as I prefer to say, social interests, which I believe is more accurate. The autistic person is prone to developing very deep and powerful interests, for example, towards academics or obscure topics, inanimate objects, TV shows, and so on. Given that the PDA person is also autistic themselves, they are no different, and might even develop interests towards the examples I've enumerated too. But the PDA person, as suggested by the criteria, is more likely to direct their obsessions or interests towards people. It is my view that the PDA social interest is quite simply no different to the well-known autistic special interest, and therefore a PDA social interest, in its purest form, is more of an intellectual pursuit than it is a method of salving emotional pain or remedying internal deficits, which would be more consistent with the social obsessions of the other conditions discussed previously. What makes this concept tricky and harder to grasp is that the PDA social interest has been observed to manifest as having different emotional flavours, namely either loving or loathing, which suggests PDA social interest must have some emotional involvement. First and foremost, the PDA social interest is an intellectual pursuit, as one would expect any other autistic special interest to be. But because these interests are, after all, directed by people at people, this will bring about a different quality to that found in interests directed at things. Very strong emotional attachments to special interests can be made, such as when they are directed towards areas of science, but because they aren't people, this process has no interpersonal element to it, unless personalization occurs, seeing things as people. For example, despite my intense love for and fascination with astronomy, I cannot recall ever feeling a romantic or sexual link between myself and the cosmos, but I can remember as a teenager when certain females in the public eye would become my special interests, who to me were so beautiful as to be personifications of something too divine for this temporal squalor to which we are bound. I would in my mind begin planning our wedding, even though I never believed in marriage as a child. Alas, harassment and stalking behaviours have been reported in PDA individuals. This is where one can't help but notice how they may take certain special interests for granted, namely those that are not sentient, conscious, or endowed with free will. Books, inanimate objects, and the internet do not simply walk away from you when they've had enough. They might actually always be within reach should one need to call upon them at a moment's notice. When a person's special interest becomes a person, it complicates everything. A special interest can mean everything to the autistic person, and for those whose interests are directed at things or topics, they may never know the pain of not being able to access their special interests at all times. Whilst it should never be condoned, it shouldn't be too difficult to understand, when viewed through an autistic lens, why social interests can be a source of immense anxiety to the PDA person, who may want nothing more than the total availability of their social interest, as if they are a lifeless possession. This need may manifest as reckless impulsivity and apparent disregard for the feelings of the social interest, who may eventually walk away upon realising their very humanity has been disrespected and their boundaries violated. Now, when the social interest walks away, the sudden loss of control and change may lead the PDA person to stalk and harass. This is not the same as fear of abandonment as observed in BPD, as that would suggest a more internal focus or need. The PDA person's social obsessions are more characterised by what can be gained and controlled as opposed to what will be lost, which suggests a more external focus. The autistic special interest is more about getting a fix of something, as opposed to being abandoned by something or someone in the PDA person's case. I should note here that despite the PDA person's enormous capacity for empathy and morality, the hunger for control and the unrelenting gravitational pull of a special interest can often prevail. This does not make the PDA person a bad person, it simply highlights an ongoing internal conflict between their needs and their goodness. When I form an intense PDA interest in someone, fundamentally it is ignited by the same processes as when I form an intense interest in something. I set out to devour every last scrap of information there is to know about the person, as increasingly they pervade and dominate every aspect of my being. In the past, I have noticed myself method acting when I have become interested in a well-known actor, philosopher, or intellectual whom I can study in interviews or clips via YouTube. I would take on the mannerisms, gait, and even the turns of phrase of my social interests subtly, where I could, so as to not give myself or my social interest away. I still do this to this day to keep my social interests a secret, unless they are a musician, in which case there is no hiding it, as I am impelled to learn all of their songs on guitar and piano. This method acting would mean that I could essentially bring my social interest with me wherever I go. This is not the same as fandom, which implies a more emotional basis to an interest, overlaid by smatterings of intellectual engagement. PDA social interests have an intellectual basis to them, overlaid by emotions, the complete opposite. Do you see the difference? For example, when I was working in Chicago recently, I got into an Uber one day and requested for the driver to drive me 25 miles southeast to a small 2-bedroom house in Gary, Indiana, which happened to be the house in which Michael Jackson was born and spent the first 11 years of his life. It was hard for me to convince the Uber driver that I wasn't actually a Michael Jackson fan. I was embarking on this trip purely for autistic reasons. The driver just couldn't bring himself to believe that a person, a tourist, on their day off would request a 45-minute Uber ride to one of the most run-down towns in the US and back if they weren't some die-hard Michael Jackson fan. The truth was, Michael Jackson was one of the first PDA social interests I can remember having. I still maintain I am not a fan and have no real emotional attachment to him. I am just completely fascinated and intellectually plugged in. When I was younger, I developed a negative social obsession towards the host of a now axed controversial chat show. I would often express my impassioned fury towards this person to others whom I would invariably bore with my constant rants. I would be asked, why are you so obsessed with them? And I'd be told to just stop researching them if it makes you so angry. But I couldn't. I was addicted to finding new reasons to hate this person. Interestingly, I would never want my negative PDA social interests gone. It would seem that having something to moan about is more important than having nothing to moan about at all. I once said of someone I worked with, it's not that I hate them, it's that I'm severely allergic to them. Please don't ever make me work near them. There is another side to PDA social obsessions, though, where the word obsession might actually be applicable. Say, for example, it takes a negative form, something we have to make very quick decisions as to whether someone is good to take on or whether they ought to be discarded. We can never be hypervigilant to a state of absent-mindedness in people. We can be hypervigilant to a state of absent-mindedness in people. We need to be on the same level as people in order to trust and relate to them. So we have to scan people, their tone of voice, their ability to or capacity to relate to the autistic or PDA way of being, their stress levels and how much of an effort they put into social interactions, where their primary focuses are, what their priorities are, and how many triggers they are likely to level at us. If we feel that there is a risk involved, and if we detect an unbridgeable gulf between ourselves and a person, such a person will either be refashioned into a person we'd much rather hang out with, or, to put it crudely, fucked off. The former is undesirable in my opinion, because after all, people can't help who they are. PDA can sometimes feel as though you are being torn in different directions by myriad internal processes. I am also addicted to watching reality TV programs, not for the reasons most people are, that is to say, not because I want to keep up to date with the latest gossip. No. Watching reality TV shows is one of my favourite hobbies because I'm so utterly enthralled by human behaviour. This is especially enjoyable when I am accompanied by neurodivergent friends with whom I share the same interests and who I make the same observations as. The phrases human beings come up with, how they live their lives, the decisions they make, and whether I like them or hate them will always be an area of extreme interest to my PDA brain.